thank you all so much for coming into the committee today. Our engagement around the foster care system have highlighted, like Deputy Chair did, insufficient resources and supports for foster carers. That puts those carers under severe pressure, especially when the child or young person has high levels of need. And obviously it's great to hear that you were advocating for an increase in the allowance in the budget, not just for all of the obvious reasons around better outcomes for children and all of those things, but it just makes budgetary sense when we know that it costs $6,000 to put somebody into residential care. I'm just curious to know, do you have a figure on how much is spent on that?
How much is spent on what? Sorry,
on
Deputy?
residential care rather than children being in foster homes.
Oh yes, of course, yeah.
And then, you know, in addition to that, in terms of people with high levels of need, is it the case that if somebody's in foster care, they can't get an assessment of need paid for privately by their foster family? I think it's the case that they're technically in the care of Tusla rather than the family, so then they have to wait on the list even if a family's kind of wanting to go about getting a private assessment. Okay. I'm just curious to know what the case is with that. And then there's obviously the other things that we spoke about in the previous one, but not getting the back to school allowance, for example, okay, when you're in foster care seems like an outrageous reality at the moment. Okay. Another main point from the foster care discussion was the importance of a consistent key worker in a young person's life. That aligns with evidence from the Simon community today, with particular reference to young people in the foster care process. So I'm just wondering what measures you're taking to ensure that they have access to the same support workers as much as is viable, of course.
Okay.
And finally, something I wanted to raise was around family resource centres, because they're a vital support service for vulnerable groups across the country, and we're lucky to have so many of them. But they're running on threadbare budgets, and so there's centres like Bandon and Skibbereen in my constituency that are in desperate need of permanent locations. And from a strategic position, I suppose, what are you going to do to fund and ensure the development of those family resource centres, because they are such an integral part of kind of support for people in the medium and long term?
Okay.
Yeah, those bodies are kind of entirely dependent, I suppose, on funding from Tusla, but I'm not even aware, like in dealing with those, some FRCs are in, you know, a HSE-owned building, some are not. I don't actually know how to help or support groups who need a permanent home.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, Deputy. So the consistent support worker piece, I mean, I think that's something we share, and I'd maybe let Claire Murphy just talk to that in terms of what we do try to do. It's difficult when you have a high staff turnover. Just in relation to the assessment of need, so I just want to be very careful not to stray across the definition of assessment of need as meant under the Disability Act. I know that's been a subject of significant debate in this committee with my colleagues in the Health Service Executive. In the general sense, if there's a very particular and pressing need in a care placement for somebody for a particular type of assessment that just is not available publicly or not available in a timely way, we would try to support that and try to secure that privately or help to secure it. But I'll be the first to say to you, I don't believe that's consistent across the country, and that's part of what we're now trying to change, so that for every foster carer the experience is the same. And
then if the foster carer wants to pay themselves for it, they can.
I've come across that too.
Yeah, it has to be consented to, yes.
By Tusla?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Even if they have, just on a point of clarity, even if the foster care has received the, I can't remember the legal term for it, but the additional
rights.
Thank you. Even if foster care has received enhanced rights, does the agency still need to consent?
I'll maybe let Claire just come back to that in a second, because I don't want to cut across the professional assessment piece, but what I'm saying to you in general is, by way of assessment of need in the broadest definition of that phrase, if there's generally agreement that a child needs that and it's very clear that they can't wait, be it on the public list or other availability, yes, we will assist foster carers and children to secure that. But I wouldn't say that's consistent in the way we would want it to be. So
because how is that assessed? How is that even assessed? You know, that if there's a clear need that it needs to be done timely, like, that's kind of really, you need another assessment.
You do, and that's the problem. So you do try to rely on what the professionals in the case are saying to you as well. But there can be times when there's a conflict of view between all of the people involved in the case as to what is the best assessment or what is the best approach to what the child needs. In relation to family resource centres, just say to you, The Minister, I spoke with him only 2 weeks ago, and he certainly is looking to consider and see, is it possible for maybe 2024 to looking at another round of the Family Resource Centre programme. But in the meantime, we continue to fund them. This year we increased our funding, their core funding, by 4%, which was what was available to us to do that. There are other agencies that also fund them as well, so it can be a mixed bag depending on where they operate. Some places the local authority will fund them, some places the HSE will fund them. But we're certainly committed to it, because I think what Family Resource Centres do in community is a very collective and holistic approach to supporting people. So
what would a Family Resource Centre do in that situation? Go to the, where do they go? Where's what's the process in terms of securing a permanent location?
So generally, families...
That's like core funding, not capital funding that you're speaking about.
So a lot of Family Resource Centres will get core funding from Tusla, usually around the cost of the manager of the centre and the administrative support and so on.
Do you provide any capital funding?
They don't get capital funding from us generally, no. They might get very small minor grants, but there isn't capital funding specific to Family Resource Centres that's available, because a lot of them grew up out of local initiatives where they might have started in a local authority building, if the local authority had a building. What I generally try to do with the Family Resource Programme is to encourage a multi-agency approach in the state. So if we're putting up the money for the staffing of the Family Resource Centre, I'd also have a clear expectation that organisations like the local authority, like the HSE, like the local Department of Social Protection, that they would also consider what possibilities they have to support to create, because Family Resource Centres are meant to be multi-agency, multifactorial. They're not just in the children and family space. But there is no easy answer to the capital question. I haven't yet personally heard of a Family Resource Centre that's like on the brink of...
I could tell you about two.
Okay, well, and I'm certainly very happy.
And I know there's multi-agency responsibility, but ultimately that kind of means that no one's responsible, and that's the problem. Yeah. And then, like, there's one of the Family Resource Centre that's had to move locations like 6 times in a short period of time. The manager that you're talking about, funded by Tusla, bringing the stuff into their own home for the business while they look for other properties, the disruption in services. They're in a perfect location now, but they can only get a 1-year lease every time. So there's no...
And I'm certainly very happy to hear from you on the individual circumstances and see if we can assist. But I do want to be clear, and I don't want to raise expectation.
Yeah.
The sole full funding, including capital, of Family Resource Centres is a much bigger piece than Tusla itself. And I think it's important just to say that. The back to school, I know the Minister in our recent discussions with him did say certainly he'd be very committed to seeing if he could unplug that piece. Just say the foster care allowance. I know there's a lot of criticism of it recently, and I certainly don't want, and I'm sorry to hear that people are communicating to Deputy Sherlock that they certainly felt patronised in some way. The foster care allowance of approximately 350 and 325, depending on the age of the child. I mean, it did also come with the proviso. It's totally tax-free. It's not means accessible for any other social welfare payment. It is separate to considerations in relation to children's allowance and other things. So there were considerations built into it at the time, but time has moved on and we do need to review it and we do need to look at it in a different way. And as I said, we fully support that. Just maybe on the consistency of support, and maybe just ask Claire to address that, and also the assessment of need consent issue that Deputy Costello raised.
I mean, the first thing I'd say in relation to consistency, it would be our wish that every single foster care would have what we call a link social worker, which is an allocated social worker to offer them support. Unfortunately, due to our recruitment and retention issues, that's not always possible. So in scenarios like that, what we try to do is is to never have what we call a dual unallocated case. So if there's a social worker allocated to the child, as a temporary measure, we ask that social worker to support the foster carer until such time as we can allocate a social worker. But it does come down to, like, it would be our wish to have a social worker for every what we call a link worker, but it isn't always possible. Sometimes we can get a team leader who's the manager to offer support. And in relation to the enhanced rights and the assessment, I'm not really sure in what scenario where a foster carer was awarded enhanced rights and wants an assessment, which Tusla is in agreement with providing, that why Tusla wouldn't have funded it, and in the absence of that, why I don't understand what the particular issue is, because if they have enhanced rights, the issue of consent is not an issue. So I'm wondering what were the circumstances.
My question was not in relation to enhanced rights. It was
sorry.
I interrupted and I with a follow-on that may have confused things. So apologies, Deputy Cairns.
Well, the question was just that if somebody's in foster care and the family feel or know that they need an assessment of needs,
Yes.
that they can't actually pay for that privately. We know the waiting lists are outrageous
Yes.
for that. So if a family want to pay privately for an assessment of needs, I'm told that they can't because they're not actually the guardian. Tusla is. And you say, oh, well, you know, if it's in agreement with Tusla, but I'm just wondering, like, even what is the scenario where you don't agree that there could be an assessment? Because
No, we don't. And I think the
so
bigger
there's never an
here-
issue. You always give.
There
the-
shouldn't be.
I don't
Yeah.
understand that there would be an issue, to be honest.
But I think it's back to the
Don't.
inconsistency. And I
Yeah.
think if there is a specific issue like that, please bring it
Yeah,
to us,
we'd need
you
to
know, on a
follow up on
separate
that.
Okay.
area. But I think it's
Yeah.
back to the consistency. What we want to reach a point in is that where there is an identified need for either an assessment or an intervention as part of that child's overall care plan, that Tusla would fund that consistently in the same way across the service. And when we were in last time, we spoke about the development of our therapeutic services, and we've now just moved to appoint 5 of our 6 regional therapeutic coordinators who will be looking at bringing consistency to how therapy provision and the assessment of intervention, the assessment of need is undertaken in relation to those young people in foster care. So that should bring a consistency and a clarity to the process. But if there is a particular issue, certainly please bring it to us offline.
Yeah.
Just on the private cost there, Pat will just give you the 3 costs of private residential, private foster care and public. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Deputy. I'll just kind of go a little bit wider at the statutory costs or statutory amounts that we pay out in terms of foster care. Last year were 86 million, so that was for all kids under 18. For aftercare then we paid out 27 million, which actually was an increase of about 2.5 million on the previous year. So that's been an increasing trend over the last few years. And other care costs, which will incorporate adoption, etc., around 8 million. So in statutory care we paid out 121 million last year. In addition to that, we had private foster care provision. So we have about 500 children who are in the care of private foster care or managed through private foster carers. So we paid out just under 25 million to them. So in total, between the statutory payments there on foster care, aftercare, and the independent or private foster carers, you've got a figure of about 145 million to that. There was another question somewhere along the line around private residential.
Yeah, because obviously, I
Right.
suppose when we're talking about the
Yeah.
need to increase the payment for foster carers, that of course, for one, there's a rising cost of living and it hasn't been increased in so long. There's all of those
Yeah.
obvious reasons, but also when the percentage of children in foster care is going down and the percentage of children going into residential care is rising. And I think is it 6,000 to be in residential care versus the small payment to be in foster care. So
Yeah.
like, what is the kind of the cost of having a child in residential care versus the cost of having a child in a foster family? And so, because we're talking about
Yeah.
like you're pushing on for them to do this on the budget,
Yeah.
and of course we know it makes sense for better outcomes for children.
Yeah.
But I'm just saying, from just a basic as well budgetary perspective,
Yeah.
it costs ridiculously more
Yeah.
to have a child in residential care instead. So how does it not make budgetary sense for the government to up the pay for foster families?
Yeah.
I don't understand.
And I'm going to answer that in a very straightforward way. I'd say the cost of a child in residential care, whether that's private or in our own services, is in around 7,000 per week. So that's in residential. But again, the complexity
So
of
121 million, for example, is what we're paying at the moment for children in foster care and all the types of it.
Yeah.
How much would it cost to have all of them in private residential care if people didn't?
7,000 per week. So you're talking about 350,000 per year would cover the cost of one child in a residential placement. But that's a very different scenario to the child who's in a normal foster care placement, and the numbers are obviously reflecting that. So as we said earlier on, 90% of our kids are in standard foster care arrangements. The 10% of kids who are in other arrangements have a much more complex need. So it's not a straightforward money basis, and we'd never argue that it is a one-for-one money basis. But I take your point in that the cost to the state of children who are in foster care is obviously much lower than kids who are in
Because it went
residential.
from 93% to 90, didn't it? I thought that might be because people are leaving it.